When you think about it, ships touch on virtually every aspect of our lives. Many of the things we buy, cars, televisions, food like rice and fruit, wood for furniture, even the fabrics that our clothes are made from, all comes from abroad. And some of our friends and their families work in factories, making things that we export to other countries. You probably think it's pretty easy unloading a ship, and these days it is. But it hasn't always been that way. Back in the 1700s, ships' cargoes were unloaded by hand onto the quayside, sack by sack, barrel by barrel. This was hard work, and it took a long time, which is a big problem because every 12 hours or so, the tide goes out, leaving the ship resting on the mud and the dockers idle. Bigger ships would anchor out in the Mersey and unload their cargoes onto small flat-bottomed boats called lighters, which was fine until the weather turned and the waves got rough. So, how could we keep the water at high tide even when it wasn't? The answer was to build an enclosed wet dock, and in 1715 Liverpool did just that. The old dock was built within the pool or tidal inlet off the Mersey. Ships would sail into the dock on the high tide. The gate to the dock would then be closed and the water level inside the dock remains constant while the tide goes down outside. Now, ships moored in the dock could carry on loading or unloading and not be grounded, or have to anchor out in the River Mersey. All ships need to be maintained and repaired, and this was especially true of wooden sailing boats. Weed and barnacles would be scraped off or graved, and the hull resealed with tar. So a graving dock was an important part of any port, and in 1765 Liverpool built two, designed especially for the sailing ships now using the port. A rope is run out from the ship to a capstan, a winch fixed into the ground at the side of the dock gate. As the capstan is turned by the dockers, the rope winds around the capstan like string around a yo-yo, pulling the ship through the entrance and into the graving dock. Once in the graving dock, the water would be emptied, leaving the ship resting on a line of special supports called keel blocks and propped at the sides by wooden beams. The gates were then closed and the shipwrights could continue to work on the hull of the ship even as the tide rose again. By the 1840s, Liverpool docks were so successful that over 15,000 ships entered them every year. That's an average of 50 every day. It was so crowded that something had to be done to stop the queues of boats jostling to enter and leave the dock gates. The new Albert Dock, opened in 1846, was designed as part of a one-way system. Ships entered Canning Half-Tide Dock from the River Mersey. This had two gates, so it could equalize water levels with either the river or the dock basin. Each ship would wait for permission to enter the Albert Dock, where they unloaded their cargo straight into the huge brick warehouses. The ships were then pulled into Salthouse Dock, where they would load up with new cargo, and from there they moved into Canning Dock, before heading back out into the Mersey again via Canning Half-Tide Dock. The Canning and Albert Docks were designed to handle the sailing ships of the mid-1850s, but this was exactly the time when the new technologies of the Industrial Revolution were transforming the world. Iron replaced wooden hulls, and steam power overtook sails. The first steamships were similar in size to sailing ships, but later steamships weren't. They became too wide to get through the narrow dock entrances, and too deep in the water for the docks to berth them. The larger ships headed to other docks, leaving the Canning and Albert docks to cater for small coastal vessels. For the next 100 years, goods and cargo continued to be manhandled off ships, one crate, barrel or bag at a time. But in the late 1950s, a new industrial revolution also transformed the world, this time into the one we know today. It was called Containerization. No matter what they were, goods could be packed into standard-sized metal boxes or containers. Each container took less than 2 minutes to be transferred from the ship to the quayside. Unloading a big modern ship took a matter of hours rather than days and needed much less manpower. This was good news for almost everyone. Suddenly it cost almost the same to buy cars from Japan or food from around the world. But it was bad news for the South Docks and the dockers who worked there. Until the redevelopment of the docks as a heritage site in the 1980s, the once world-leading technology of the docks and the skills of the dockers were now redundant.